research yourself?
My background is in IT,
Mm-hmm.
but I have interest in history, so I do a lot of deep diving into history. Over the weekend, I was in Syracuse, going over the archives. There's some little bit of information I was looking for, and I'm sure you've been to Syracuse.
Yeah, I've used. They also have some on microfilm that I've used.
Yeah.
But have you met Martin? He's a historian at Syracuse.
He and I have discussed by email, but we never met in person. No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we've discussed stuff by email, but we never met in person. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the microfilm there
Yeah.
at Syracuse. Yeah. All right. So maybe 2-3 more minutes, and then we get going.
Mm-hmm. How long have you been here? You're in
more than
Boston
20
area?
years.
Oh,
Correct.
really?
Oh, more than 20. Oh, I've been here a long time. I have lived in the US longer than I have lived in Kenya.
Okay.
Yeah, way longer. My kids are here, so yes. Yeah. So I presume you've been to Kenya.
Yeah.
Okay.
The first time I went was 1995.
Okay.
And yeah, there was a time when I was going almost every year just for short trips.
Okay.
For research, but yeah, now it's been a few years, of course.
Correct. Yeah. So which part of Kenya did you go to?
Originally, I did, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. My first research was in Kisii.
Okay.
But also I've been, spent a little time in Kisumu and Kakamega, Kakuma. I've got friends who live up in Chuka, and finally went to Malindi a few years ago, my first time down to see the coast. Okay.
All right. And what's your background before going for the PhD in history?
I went straight through. I was a history major at Northern Illinois University. And yeah, I realized I had no other skills other than being in school. So I decided to continue.
Okay.
And went straight through, from Northern Illinois to Northwestern for my PhD.
I see. I never knew Northwestern had a strong program in African history.
Yeah, it was one of the first, so many historically Black universities had programs in African history much earlier, but among kind of the predominantly white institutions, Northwestern was one of the first to have a dedicated African history program.
Yeah. What other colleges at the time were about the same?
So Madison was probably the other one that was a leading school for African history. And
did you look at BU, Boston University?
So that is another good school. Yeah, there's some very good things going on there.
Also Michigan State, I think.
Michigan State is very good. It kind of dipped for a while, but they have several good scholars there right now. Stanford has been very good. Indiana is a good one too.
I see. Another one that comes to mind is West Virginia.
Yeah, so they've had a number of scholars go through. That's where Martin went through, and a number of other scholars have gone through there. Yeah.
Quite. It's a long list from West Virginia because of the Professor Maxon.
Yeah, so I think and he had spent a lot of time in Kenya, and also I think he taught or was affiliated at, was it either Moi or Maseno for
Moi.
A while? Moi.
Yeah. So we are having him in 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen him in a long time, but I had first met him because he had already been doing research in Kisii for many years before I started.
Way before.
Yeah.
Before most of us were born.
That's right.
I think he went there in the early 60s before independence.
Yeah, and I don't know if his PhD was from Syracuse, but he had done work actually with that microfilm project, the KNA microfilm project.
Yeah. I don't know if it was Syracuse or Duke, but one of those two places. All right, I think we can get started. It's now almost 10 minutes past. So today we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Shadle, although he said he wants to be called Brett. Dr. Brett Shadle is a professor of African history, and he wrote, one of the books he wrote is the one that we are going to discuss today, is an interesting topic about the white settlers in Kenya. I shared the book title and the front cover to the group, so everybody is familiar with the book. And if I may say a few things, the topic that we are discussing and that you wrote about and researched is a very important topic. It goes into some of the challenges we still have in Kenya today. It's about land. It also goes into other things, for example, about the humiliation, which you and I discussed by email earlier. It goes into racial discrimination. And the topic of land is so central to Kenya today, so central. It's ever at the top of discussion in politics, socioeconomics discussions, everything, you name it. It's one of the topics that's never too far from any discussion. So it's a very important topic, and we are happy that you accepted this invite to come and discuss your book, discuss your work. And I'm speaking for myself. I'm eager to know how you got interested in this topic and how it feels for you as a Caucasian to go into some of these topics that are very can be controversial or can be sensitive, quite sensitive to discuss today. Because, as you know, I don't have to tell you, there are many schools of thought about how to handle this. Some people want to just say it happened in the past, it's gone, and we shouldn't dwell too much on it. Some people want to learn, like I do. Others may want to use it for the wrong ends. So it's a very important topic, as I mentioned. So what we are going to do is to give you maybe 20-30 minutes to tell us about how you got into Kenyan history, how much research you did on the ground, talking to people if you did, and also if you want to read from the book, maybe a passage or two or a little snippet here that you think is relevant to the discussion, you're free to do so. And after that, we will then have a Q&A. And the meeting is being recorded, just so you know. We do share this on YouTube. So I think I sent you the link to a previous session we did.
Yeah, within Googie.
Yes, correct. So I wanted to let you know that it is being recorded. That's always good to keep in mind. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I apologize that you watching Googie and then I come and come second. It must be quite a letdown to see me after you've seen in Googie. I'm very happy to be here tonight with everyone to talk about the book. It's actually been a few years since I've read any of it. I finished it and moved on. So before tonight, I went back and looked back a little bit at it to refamiliarize myself with it. But I'll tell you a little bit first about how I came upon this topic. I did my PhD work at Northwestern University, and that's when I first became interested in African history, Kenyan history in particular. And just through reading a few books, I became very interested in Kisii, Gusiland. And that's where I did my first research in the 90s and early 2000s, my dissertation and what became my first book, which was about marriage and colonialism, marriage disputes, primarily between the 1930s through the 1960s. And speaking, as Daniel had said, speaking a little bit about sources, one of the most important sources that I discovered for that research were court cases that had kind of been left behind. Some of them, starting in the late 30s, early 40s, and then 50s and 60s, about 2,000 court cases altogether. They're called Ritongo, which were the local name for the Kenya courts. The Kiama would be more familiar from central Kenya. But there were these court cases that were taken down in Swahili by there were marriage disputes, women who had either left their husbands, young women who had left their fathers to elope with a young man, and those under British colonial rule were considered quasi-criminal, so that the man could be taken to court for living with a woman for whom he hadn't given bride wealth. So I found all of these very, very rich court cases in which fathers and husbands, or fathers and the young men that these women had gone to, and then sometimes the women themselves, were all arguing over what marriage meant at this point in time, where bride wealth had risen extremely high and many young men couldn't afford to marry. Some women ended up with men that they didn't want to be with. So they're all in these court cases, in these courtrooms in front of local elders, trying to decide what marriage went and what the place was of women's consent to marriage. To what extent could a woman decide, I want to marry this man, or I don't want to marry this man? And that was, it was fascinating research to get these court cases where people are saying, no, I gave bride wealth, so she's my wife, nothing else matters. And the woman, and maybe the man she was living with, saying, no, she came by her own volition, by her own will, to come and live with me, and that's what counts. That's what matters in making this marriage. And so that was a good chunk of my life, doing that dissertation research and producing that book. It was called Girl Cases, that came out, I think, around 2006. But as I was doing that research, one of the things that then led me towards this book, there were also sexual assault cases that came before those courts, before the Ritongo. And what was fascinating, I mean, they're disturbing cases, but what was very interesting is that in many of these cases, a woman could come forward and say that this man assaulted me. And in some of the cases, and we hear this, we hear this in the United States, we hear this in the West, all over, the young man would say, no, she consented, she was a willing partner, and now she's lying about this. And in the courts that we know in the United States, the courts have often, less so recently, but often the courts would say, believe the man, tell the woman, you have to prove that he's lying. How do we know that you actually did resist? You have to show some kind of evidence that you didn't want to have sex. And the British courts in Kenya were the same, that they were very, very doubtful of taking a woman's word in a case like this. But in these cases out in Kisii, the court elders would instead say to the man, the accused, why would she lie about this, right? If you two were lovers, if you were boyfriend, girlfriend, why would she make up such a serious charge against you? And if he could produce no other evidence, they would convict this young man. And so I had an article come out about 10 years ago or so that discussed these court cases and essentially said that what we often think is the norm in these courts, that the court elders or the judges will automatically believe the man and distrust the woman. In many of these cases, that was overturned. That was tipped on its heads, that they would believe the woman and wonder why she would make up a story. Why would she lie about something so serious and then convict the accused? And that was, I think that's still one of the few historical works on sexual violence in Kenya. There have been some anthropological studies, work by people in gender studies at, in the West, at the University of Nairobi and elsewhere, about sexual violence in Kenya. But it was one of the few, I think it's still one of the few, that deals with the topic historically. And so it got me interested in this topic about how, in different communities, pre-colonially, colonially, people understood issues around sexual violence, how the courts handled them, how the Council of Elders handled them. And so my idea was that this would become a book, that I would write a book about this history. In doing so, the first chapter I decided to look at was on what was called Black Peril. And this was a term that was used kind of across many parts of the white world in the 19th and into the 20th century. This idea that Black people, or depending on where it was, in India or in Australia, that non-white men were going to go and assault all the white women. So it was this fear, and in almost every case it was baseless, right? It was in the imagination of white people, but this very real fear that non-white men were going to go out and attack all the white women. And there were episodes of this in Kenya. I discussed some in my book at different time periods. It was very common in South Africa, in what's now Zimbabwe, in India. You also see that in the US South, that was the usual explanation for lynching, even if there was no sexual violence, no woman involved at all. But the lynchers would use that as an excuse, right? They would bring up this image of the Black man raping white women. And so I was going to start the first chapter of my book. I was going to look at this topic about Black Peril, because there were several in Kenya. The one in 1920, 1921, this fear, it was in all the newspapers. There are all these ridiculous accusations. At one point, a woman was just kind of bumped in the street, and that became in the newspaper, in the news, an attempted assault. And it just became more and more heightened. Settlers were demanding, martial law almost. And that eventually became that one. And then again in the 1920s, where rape became a capital crime, right? So that someone who was guilty of rape could be hanged. And the first time that happened was 1928 in Kenya. Was an African man convicted of raping a white woman. So this was something that scholars had looked at in many parts of the world, many settler colonies, like I say, in Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa. But as I started to research and look into this more, I started, and I'll talk in a little bit more about the book, about what I'm arguing in there, but it continued to expand. I realized that there are many things I had to talk about and explain about settlers in order to explain why interracial rape was kind of the thing, why that was the image that could silence all criticism, that could unite all white settlers around this, that it could, as much as settlers and government officials argued, if settlers said, if you do this, it will cause Black peril, it kind of silenced the colonial government. You can't argue against that. So as I kept diving into this, the chapter continued to expand. I realized I had to explain, things about civilization and paternalism and the law. And so it eventually then kind of got out of hand and became the book. It turned from a book that was, I'd hoped to be about the history of sexual violence, became a book about white settlers, which I didn't want it to be, and I never thought I would be a scholar of white settlers in Kenya. I consider myself a historian of Africa, and while this is certainly an important part of the history of Kenya, it wasn't what I imagined myself writing. And so that was kind of the genesis of it. But as I was continuing the research, there were two things that struck me that kind of gave meaning to me for this research, more than just a historical topic that I think is important. There were two things in particular that I think gives it a greater importance. And the one was simply to counteract all the celebratory work about white settlers that exists in Kenya. When you go through any of the bookstores, at the airport, if you go to Prestige, if you go to any of the bookstores in Kenya, if you at any of the hotels at the Norfolk, that's the images of these exciting white settlers, right? And it's a romantic and it's an image that's sold to the West, to people in Britain, in Europe, in the United States. That's the image of the white settler, is that they're pioneers, that they're in this gorgeous land, that they are loving to their Africans, that they're bringing civilization, that they tame this wilderness. And it's all very exciting and it's very romantic. I have avoided watching Out of Africa, the movie, because having read the book, it's actually, Karen Blixen was, I don't know, she was a horrible person, really. Reading the way that she talks about Africans in that book, it was extremely patronizing. She treated them and called them her children. These adults called them her children. There's a passage where she says she had a Somali servant, and this man, Farah, kept saying, that he'd like to go to school. This is in the teens and 20s, that he'd want to go to school, and she kept resisting because she kept thinking that education ruined Africans, that he was a good person, that he was this kind of primitive, savage something, a good servant, but if you gave him education, it would take that away, it would ruin him. But in all of these other books and movies, the settlers are these romantic figures that are celebrated. And so I kept running against these as I was researching these settlers. Those were the books that would come up. Those were the books about settlers. And so part of what I wanted to do was take my research and say, well, okay, this is the image of Karen Blixen, but let's look at the other things that she did. And this is Lord Delamere had a 2-volume biography of him written by Elspeth Huxley that's very celebratory. Well, let's look at the other side of Lord Delamere. So part of what I hope this book would do is offer that other side, kind of the uglier side of the settlers. But the other thing that struck me as I was researching this, and all of the talk about, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, but settlers were obsessed with deference, right? They insisted that Africans defer to them in every way. So always you had, every white man had to be called Bwana. Anytime an African, passed a white person, they'd have to take off their hat, and say, yes, Bwana, no Bwana. That settlers demanded that kind of deference, regardless of, if it was a white child, if it was a poor man, if it was an uneducated man, every white person expected deference from every African. And as I was reading this, it struck me more and more. And I would say mostly, I experienced this more, I think, in the 1990s and early 2000s, less so maybe in the last 10 years or so in my travels to Kenya. But, and especially, kind of upcountry, there's still something, the way that many people treat Wazungu. I can recall being in a restaurant in, I think it was in Ogembo out in Kisii. And I was sitting there with a friend, a local Gusii man, and the waiter came up and took my order and then turned away, right? Didn't even see almost the friend I was with, because, it was an Mzungu at the table. I recall a case where I was going into an uchumi with 2 African-American colleagues, students at the time. And they stood and watched. And I, without thinking, I walked in, I had a bag over my shoulder. And the man who was taking bags from everybody else simply watched me walk in. And my 2 friends went up to him and said, why did you do that? Why'd you let him walk in like that? And essentially his answer was, he's an Mzungu. I thought he was somebody important, or I thought he was a manager. Many times, I'm in a cab, it pulls up to a gate somewhere, the askari comes out, and then he sees me. He sees the Mzungu and he opens the gate. So there were all these instances that I experienced where, being an Mzungu, I was treated differently. right. Elder men would come, and shake my hand like that, right, where they would grasp their arm, and there was no reason to. I was a young man. I didn't have my PhD yet. So there are all these cases where I started to realize there was still in some places in Kenya where the Mzungu is treated differently. And it struck me that I needed to try to understand what the roots of that were. Like, why is whiteness still in some places really, really important in Kenya? And I would say I noticed that far less in Nairobi than I do in more rural areas. I notice it less now, I think, than I did, 20 years ago. But I also noticed my current research includes some work in Ethiopia, which had only been colonized for 5 years, where there's far less attention paid to me as a Ferengi, as a white man, than I see in Kenya or in Tanzania, for that matter. So I'd love to hear your thoughts of others on that. So that was kind of what I hope to do in this book, is figure out for myself, at least, and hopefully for Kenyans also, what some of that kind of lingering meaning of whiteness and where that came from. So for the book itself, I drew on a lot of newspapers. White settlers published, I think the only one that's still in existence from that period is the Standard, East African Standard. There are a whole series of other newspapers that lasted a few years, lasted a couple of decades. And I spent a good chunk of my life sitting in front of a microfilm machine, reading page after page of these newspapers, and just trying to get in the sense of what these settlers were thinking, what they wrote about, what the newspaper articles were about, looking at their memoirs, looking at colonial documents from the KNA in Nairobi and the British National Archive in London, and their published works. And after kind of getting into this, trying to get into their mindset, and so the book, The Souls of White Folk, is kind of this sense of trying to understand from their perspective, what it was, how they understood themselves and their lives. And what I came up with is that the things that really animated their lives and their thinking was this belief in civilization that was mixed with whiteness. So this idea that Britons and other white people had developed civilization over many centuries, and it was kind of important for them to bring it to Kenya. So it also mixed with this paternalism and trusteeship, that the idea that Africans were more childlike, they weren't developed, and it would take many decades, maybe many centuries, before Africans could be as civilized as white people. So in the meantime, they could give this ideology is that we're not here to, just become wealthy, although that was clearly, part of it. They could tell themselves and tell others that we're here to help Africans. We're here in the language that you hear now as development. That NGOs come to bring development. In those days, it was the white settlers coming to bring civilization and morality. And that paternalism that they felt. I also noticed how emotional it was in many of their memoirs and things that they wrote, where, as much as we can discount it, that they weren't really trying to help Africans. They were out to become wealthy and take land and live their own lives. But at least the idea that they had within themselves, that they were bringing something, that they were helping these African children, that Karen Blixen thought of all of her retinue of servants and squatters as her children, that had a great deal of emotional meaning for the settlers. Like, it was real to them that they were kind of the parents of these African children as they saw them. The other idea of prestige, which goes along with deference, this notion that Africans would almost automatically defer to white people, that they would believe white people to be stronger, more intelligent, more brave, more civilized, and that so long as Africans felt that way, that every white person would be safe. And the settlers would call this prestige. That is, so long as a white person had prestige, that Africans treated them with deference, then everything would be fine. But they had to make sure that white people acted civilized. So there's actually a lot of fighting amongst settlers over what it meant to be civilized. So poor whites would be deported because they would bring down prestige. An African could never see a poor white person. How could there be a poor white person? How could there be a drunk white person? Because that would reduce the image of the Mzungu in the eyes of the African. They also, settlers were very free using physical violence against Africans. Settlers understood that to be critical kind of in making Africans listen. They would often use the phrase, spare the rod, spoil the child, because in the same way that settlers thought Africans were childlike, they needed to be corrected, with a cane, with a slap, in order to help the process of them growing towards civilization, but also just very much as a tool of control. And that violence, was every day. It was just very, very common. Settlers didn't hesitate to tell in the newspapers, in their memoirs, that how they beat their servants. How much of it, there was one settler woman who wrote back to her friends in the UK, part of her job of becoming a settler wife was trying to understand how much you beat a servant when they break a dish. And then finally, the law as well. Settlers insisted that the colonial state and the legal system support them in controlling Africans. And so that all kind of brought me back then to the issue of Black Peril. And it was only by understanding kind of all of those issues together that I say that we could understand why Black Peril was kind of the nightmare for settlers, because it was not only an assault on a single woman, but it overturned everything that they believed in. It meant that, it was Africans using violence against whites. It was the law not being strong enough to prevent this. It meant that these childlike people that we're taking care of have rejected us as their superiors. It meant there was no prestige left at all. Africans were not showing deference. And so that just kind of meant the end of any security that settlers might feel. And that's, I ended the book around 1928, which is when the first African man was hanged for sexual assault on a white woman. Because in a way, I think it kind of culminated what settlers had been trying to do for the previous 25 or 30 years, which was finally kind of bend the colonial state and the legal system to demonstrate in the death of an African man that it supported white settlers and the kind of white settlers as being the most important thing in Kenya. I think I'll stop it there. I think I've been talking too much. I'm a professor. That's what we do is we continue to talk. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right. Thank you very much. And before we go into the Q&A for everybody, I have to say, in my opinion, the extreme deference shown to white people in Kenya is true, at least in my opinion, and I would like to hear what other people here say. It is true, and it is unfortunate because it gets abused by some people, by some white people. It does get abused to this day, and it is also demeaning to ourselves. So that's an interesting subtopic all in itself, the phenomenon, and it is something that's rarely discussed, very rare. Before we go into, I open the floor to other people with a question. I have one or two questions for you. Number one, you've looked into a lot of characters and ordinary people in Kenya during the colonial days. For the period you studied, you did the research, are there some white people who struck you as being ahead of their time in terms of racial justice?
Yeah, so and the two, and we communicated a bit, Norman Lees and McGregor Ross, who worked for the colonial government, who both left and went back and wrote these famous books about essentially, in the 1920s, saying how bad things were in Kenya, how bad the settlers were, how bad the colonial government was. But they had to leave Kenya before they could write that. It was extremely difficult, I think, for a white person to remain in Kenya and be that outspoken and that critical of the racism, of the violence, of the injustices. It was very difficult for, they would essentially have been ostracized entirely from white society had they done it there. And so there were some people like them who had gone back to London. The other person you had mentioned, Archdeacon Owen, who was stationed, I think, at Messina out in the West, was a missionary who was also very outspoken against settler injustice. And he, the settlers did not like him. Many times the colonial officials didn't like him. He was very willing to write letters back to newspapers, to the Manchester Guardian, to alert people back in London and in the UK about injustices that were taking place in Kenya. And there were many critics in London of the settlers. Many people on the left were, condemned the settlers for the land alienation, for the violence. There were these cases of settlers who would assault or even kill Africans and be, not even charged or not convicted, or if convicted, just given a small penalty. But even what's interesting, two things in these cases that even somebody like even somebody like Archdeacon Owen was extremely paternalistic. He saw it as his job to protect his Africans. So there's still, as much as they're critical of the racism of the time, they're still inhabiting that world themselves. The other thing that, no, go ahead.
And I should mention, Norman Lays was a key person in helping the Maasai bring up a lawsuit against the colonial government in 1913 after they were moved. And McGregor Ross hosted Kenyatta when Kenyatta went to the UK the first time. But go ahead before we go to the other questions.
So, and one of the things that often strikes me about those kind of characters is, here in the United States, you'll often hear, people might condemn the Confederacy, we might condemn slaveholders, and other people will come back and say, but that's just the way the world was. People were racist then, people held slaves. There was nobody condemning slavery, except there was, of course. And I had been, at various times, had received comments from, descendants of settlers or people who love the settlers and saying, you're being unfair, you're criticizing these settlers, but everybody was like that at that time. You're using today's ethical and moral guidelines to condemn settlers. But the examples of somebody like Norman Lays and McGregor Ross show that no, there were plenty of white people at the time, maybe not in Kenya, but plenty of white people who understood the injustice. They understood the injustice of land alienation and racism and violence.
Yeah. One more question, and then I let other people ask. Did you find cases of interracial marriage or relationships authentic, meaning both sides went into it willingly without coercion?
So I did not, and part of it is that the sources that I found, I want to hear more about things that you found, were not discussed, or were just kind of, it would be talked about in whispers that there's that man who lived, out in the bush and had married an African woman, or was living with an African woman. And so it was kind of in whispers in most of the sources that I saw. And it's also difficult to understand how that relationship might work in a place where the power differential is so great, right? Where the white man there were white men who literally murdered in cold blood Africans, and where they're not charged or were found guilty after the white jury didn't even leave their seats. So it's it's a little bit difficult from this removed to see what kind of relationship that would be.
All right. We can come back into that, but I want to give the floor to other people who may have questions. So to the other folks on the call, do you have questions or comments to Brett?
Yes, hello, Professor Brett.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful presentation. And first and foremost, thank you for the good work you're doing, or you've done, the research work you've done in Kenya. And I'm actually impressed. You decided to choose the Kisii region, or the Gusii people. There's not too much research done about those guys. I have a couple of questions. The first question is, have you read Out of Africa by Karen Blixen? And what do you think of her? The second question is, in your visit to Kenya in 1995, did you meet Dr. Richard Leakey or Philip Leakey? And then number three is, there's some Kisii or Gusii cultures, such as if the husband dies, the wife can choose the other husband from the brothers. If you did a bit of research on that, maybe you could elaborate how she chose and how successful they were. The other question is, in your research, what's your opinion, or what did you think, or did you witness any female genital mutilation among the Kisii people? And did you do anything about it? Were you shocked? Were you? That's my question. And thank you very much. And my last point is actually a remark is just to correct the image that was portrayed by CNN and other medias, that Kenya is a hub where students are writing papers for other people, American students and that kind of thing. It's just a small, and I could be corrected, it's just a small fraction of students, either here in US, also back home, but majority of Kenyans are hardworking. And probably those guys who are doing that, they were just looking for something to eat. But majority of them are very hardworking. And of course, for them even to be able to write papers, they had to go through the APA format of writing and research and that kind of thing. So not everybody does it, but you know, it was portrayed like every student in Kenya does that. But yeah, thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the American media, you know, barely knows where Kenya is. You know, I mean, you've seen on CNN, and you know, the Kenya Twitter is very good at taking CNN to task anytime they say the things that aren't quite right. So several of the questions, yes, Out of Africa is extremely frustrating read because of the nature of who she was and how she saw herself. So Karen Blixen never had children of her own, but she constantly said that her servants are like her children. And her vision of Africans were either they were childlike or they were very proud, like Somalis. She loves Somalis. Some of the words that she uses describing Somali are almost erotic or pornographic, the way that she describes them. But it was this image that these are people who are kind of this proud and ancient people who have no use for civilization, have no use for the modern world. And she loved them because of that. Many settlers were the same. Many settlers, Lord Delamere loved his Maasai, as he would say. Dennis Fitch Hatton, I think he also had it was Karen Blixen's lover, also had a Somali servant. And the settlers, many cases, except when Maasai were on land that they wanted, they loved Maasai because Maasai, in this image, never wanted to be civilized, right? In this image that the settlers had, Somalis never wanted to be civilized. And Karen Blixen was just the same then, that they didn't like and they didn't trust Africans who were educated, who, you know, were too good of a Christian, who wanted to dress in Western style clothes, because those Africans threatened white settler rule, right? If any African could become civilized, could speak, the Queen's English as well as any settler, then that equivalence between white and civilized and black and uncivilized got very confused. So Blixen and the others loved any African who was very proud of his own culture and wanted nothing to do with white culture. But that ended up being, in many cases, also very infantilizing towards adult Africans, calling them her children. I have an ongoing debate with a friend of mine from Kisii. He keeps threatening to take me to the Blixen Museum, and I keep refusing to go. I didn't meet any of the Leakeys. The father of them all, Louis Leakey, well, I guess not quite the father, his father had been a missionary. Louis Leakey was another interesting character because he, like Karen Blixen, liked to think of herself not like the other settlers in some way, that she was more high-minded. Leakey did as well, like to think of himself as not racist like the other settlers because he would work next to Africans in their archaeological digs. But he was also very sure, he had his very particular ideas that he knew the Gikuyu better than the Gikuyu. So, and during the Mau Mau trials, he served as an expert witness and as a translator. And often the translations that he used were not quite right, as some of the African witnesses pointed out. And some of the work in Kisii on widow remarriage and FGM, I didn't come across too many of the cases about the levirate marriage. It is there, but it didn't come up in many of the sources that I did use. The work on it's been called various things: female circumcision, female genital mutilation, female genital surgery. It's definitely, I think it's decreased now, but I think in the, when I first started studying there, I think it was something like 90% of girls and young women underwent it. I'm trying, I'm trying not to put any judgments in here, and so I would discuss with people what it meant and, why it was still being done and what people felt about it. I think the importance historically of initiation and circumcision or surgery for men and women in Kisii was a dividing line against the Luo, who shared so many borders. It was a way to kind of define themselves also in opposition to their Luo neighbors. And so I think, like, culturally, I think it was very important there. In the same way, in central Kenya and other parts of Kenya, the initiation process is very critical to defining, who's a boy and who's a man, who's a girl and who's a woman, who can get married and who can't.
All right. Anybody else with a question? Yeah. Anybody else? Agnes or Joseph? And while they come up with their own questions, I would like to know, when you do your research, you go to these archives, especially when the research is on the earlier period of colonialism. It's very rare to come across extensive or detailed perspective or the voice of the African. I think you would agree. It's very difficult to come across the perspective of the African at that time. So how did you handle that?
It is, and historians have in earlier periods, historians did not, when looking at that early colonial period, historians of the 1960s, 70s, 80s were able to do interviews with the elders who were still alive, who recalled those eras, and some of those are still available. Often it's just a process of digging through the sources, and you'll just find a little bit here and there. You often don't find, the kinds of sources that are available for these white settlers. You don't find 10 different newspapers. You find a few copies of things by Harry Thuku. You find a few things by, and I can't pronounce the Gikuyu name of the newspaper that the KCA started. The Reconciler is the version of it in English. So there are a few written sources like that. But what I've often found, and part of the reason that I used court cases so often in my first book and then also for this book, is that even though it's in a court and it's a strange place and how people present evidence is kind of limited, those are sources or criminal investigations where you have the voices of Africans being collected very intentionally by the state. And while they're not perfect, there are ways in the archives where you can kind of tap into and find African voices that the colonial state probably didn't want to be there, but that ended up there.
All right, Joseph, you have a question?
Yeah, I probably have a question. And I think the newspaper he was referring to was Moigwithania.
Thank you.
It's at a certain point edited by Jomo Kenyatta.
Mm.
Yeah, it's amazing. I had a little, my father always has a piece of it, a part of one of the editions. And it's amazing how, you know, they managed to reach so many people using such a tool. And, you know, made the fire, you know, in the belly of those who ended up fighting for freedom. Anyway, I have read up another book by a son of a missionary who grew up in Kenya, in Kijabe, Skate Wilson, and it's Take Nothing With You. That's the book he ended up writing. And he talks about the missionaries and why it should never have happened, the mission one, why it was so, and he bases his research around Kikuyu land. And I took interest in it because he grew up in Kijabe, and I went to high school in Kijabe myself. So I took interest. And when I read that book, and then I'm listening to you, and I've read a few other books that talks, that addresses the same problem. I can clearly see one, colonialism was a dangerously criminal enterprise. Yeah, and I don't think there's any other way of putting it. Mm. And maybe before I ask my question, let me say, I have sat down with my brother, who is married to a Norwegian, and we sit down in a hotel in Nairobi, and we eat, and then the guy who is serving us will always give the bill to my brother's wife. And my brother ended up actually divorcing his wife last year. And that was one of the things that keeps recurring everywhere they go in Africa. And he talks about it in a very sad way. So that difference that you talked about is real. And I have seen it up close and personal, like they say. Anyway, so I want you to look at to give us an idea of where we are today. For example, we are in the United States right now. And we have a lot of controversy, with people saying, no, that was my great-grandfather. That wasn't me. I didn't colonize you. I didn't make you a slave. I didn't do this. That debate continues even to date here in USA. I wonder what you have to say about it, talking to Kenyans today in this time and age. I'm sure you got something to say about that. And I want to hear it.
Thank you for that question. Yes, and this is something, you know, being in the United States, you hear this all the time, people saying, I never owned slaves, I never colonized you, you know, why are you blaming me? And then you also hear, you know, some liberal white people expressing guilt, like, I'm so sorry, I'm so very sorry, I feel guilty about this. And from my perspective, for historical injustices, I can't feel the guilt of the sins of my grandparents.
Yes.
You know, they certainly, and I don't want my children, I have 2 boys, I don't want them to feel guilt for the sins I have committed. You know, I can feel guilt for the things that I have done. But at the same time, we live in a world where the benefits that have accrued to me through nothing that I've done, you know, just by being who I am, that I can travel to Kenya and get a visa at the airport, pay my dollars, and you know, walked right in, and a friend from Kenya to come visit me, you know, bank accounts and statements and witnesses and everything, just to be able to come visit on a tourist visa. So I continue to benefit from the sins that were committed by my ancestors, or the, you know, people in the colonial officials, the settlers, and people in Kenya continue to suffer from the sins that were committed against them decades ago. So it's absolutely true that you know, I never colonized anyone, I've never enslaved anyone, but I cannot claim to deserve all the benefits that I have today, that were simply granted to me by virtue of where I was born and what color skin I have. And in the same way that you know, other people don't deserve to, you know, have disadvantages because of who they are and where they were born. So I think it's you know, for me, it's a question of the justice of today. You know, we need to understand the injustices of the past, because they continue into today. I don't think that guilt for the past helps. I think we can talk about, you know, the fact that I continue to benefit, that says something, that's something we can address. But as a historian, we have to, I insist we have to know the historical background and the roots to, you know, the way that the world is today.
All right.
Yeah, and I'm glad you are not just another white liberal, because they have the idea of the liberal condemning something that they don't even seem to understand. It's simply an intellectually raised position to take. You know, and it really angers me. Now, let me make a follow-up on the same. Now, if you go back to Kenya, here we deal with racism, and in Kenya we deal with tribalism. I wonder whether you noticed anything like tribal privilege among some people in Kenya that would end up giving us this kind of a discussion in Kenya somewhere 20, 30, 40 years to come.
That's interesting. I need to be careful. I don't need to be sucked into Kenyan
well,
ethnic
you gotta
politics.
be intellectually honest. And that's what I asked for, intellectual honesty.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, certainly we can, I think the narrative that, you know, when Kenyatta was in power, central Kenya developed, and when Moi was in power, you know, Rift Valley developed. There's certainly aspects of that, and definitely, you know, Nyanza was ignored, you know, while Kenyatta was in power. But my sense is that first, there's poor people everywhere in Kenya. There are people who are marginalized everywhere in Kenya. And if you are, you know, a landless, you know, Gikuyu, you know, working hand to mouth as a laborer, or if you're landless, you know, somewhere out in, you know, in Siaya, you're still landless, right? The fact that if your man is in the state house or not, you're not eating more. So there were certainly, some individuals who became very wealthy because of, that who you were related
tribal connection,
because of your connections. Sure. But I do think there are areas, up in Turkana areas, Northeast, I think that is an area that maybe not because of what tribe you belong to, but geographically also, that have been marginalized for 100 years now. And, if you happen to be born in Mandera or, Locochogio, your life chances are very, very poor compared to even to somebody born in Korea or someplace, very kind of distant from Nairobi.
I agree. Thank you.
I have to say that the last question from Joseph is a very insightful question. It's a very deep question. It's a question that should be debated and discussed for a much longer period than 10 minutes. And it should be discussed by a lot of people. I want to give this chance to Agnes, if you have a question, before I go to another. I have a long list of questions myself. Agnes, any question? All right, before Agnes speaks, I'm sure you've thought about South Africa. A lot is happening today, and it's very sad, very unfortunate. So in your opinion, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here because that's a very hot issue. What's your thoughts about how these challenges or problems can be addressed? Because on the one hand, you had injustices done. I don't think there is any honest person who can deny that. On the other hand, you have the white generation who have been there for generations. What do you think? You say anything. You don't have to give us an answer. Anything. I know it's a very complex problem.
Yeah. So, I would be the last person to question the wisdom of Nelson Mandela. But, even with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, people were able to speak the truth and not be prosecuted if they came and essentially confess their sins. And I think there was something very healing about that. But there wasn't the kind of economic reckoning and social reckoning and, honestly, redistribution that probably should have happened. I think that would have caused other troubles as well. I think Western Europe and the United States get very uneasy when anyone talks about redistribution of wealth. But I think allowing, the economy to continue, and with a few Africans becoming extremely wealthy also, I think that same conversation should have been had in Kenya at independence. Kenyatta was very clear, telling the settlers, nothing will change, right? Just because there's now Kenyatta in the State House rather than a white man, things are going to continue. We're not going to take your land away. If you want to sell, we'll buy, but if you don't want to sell. And tried not to talk about Mau Mau either, right? We're not going to talk about it. It was in the past. We'll just move forward. And so I think in both of those cases, without a real reckoning with past injustices and trying to address them, the same thing in the United States after the Civil War, we had this short period of Reconstruction where there were actual attempts to have African Americans in positions of power and protect them with the US military so that they could vote. And then once that was ended, that's when we get Jim Crow. That's when we get, the rise of lynching. And I think there's a temptation at times, in these instances to not disrupt things too much in some of these cases, which, then we end up with, as Mzee was saying, we still get the Norwegian woman being given the check in Kenya, 70 years, 60 years down the line now.
All right. Any other question? Sam, you have a question. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yes, thank you.
We'll come back to you, Joseph. We'll come back to you.
Thank you, Professor Brett, again. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, and we've all heard about the Salem witches. We read about it. What stereotypes have you heard about the Kisii people? And can you mention the aspect of, I've heard, not that I've seen, I've heard that they're very mystical, they have some voodoo or that kind of thing. And if you experienced any or if anything frightened you, and you may also mention if you have a religion or, and how did you reconcile all these cultures that you did not understand? And was it real? Was the magic real? Explain, yeah.
So I'm not going to suggest anyone's belief in witchcraft is true or not true. I don't believe in it, but that's absolutely, I had heard that from other places in Kenya. And this is part of the tribalism we were talking about, is the ethnic stereotyping. I hear from many people in Kenya, the Kikuyu are like this, the Kamba like this, the Kisii are like this. And that was always one that I'd heard is the association of witchcraft, night runners in Kisii. And speaking with people and it had traditionally been primarily Catholic and Seventh-day Adventists in Kisii. There are more Pentecostals there now, many more PAG. But speaking with friends, a lot of whom were SDAs, asking how they could reconcile this belief in witchcraft with their very devout Christianity. And they absolutely would believe that witchcraft existed, but they made it fit, which was very much a pre-colonial idea, that belief in witchcraft existed before the missionaries arrived in Southwest Kenya. But they could reconcile it by saying, well, witches are people who tap into demonic energy. So rather than however they might have explained witchcraft 120 years ago, they could explain it as Christians as being people who do have access to supernatural powers, but they do it through demonic energy, demons, devil worship, things like that. I never experienced any witchcraft. I did see a woman once who had been accused of witchcraft, and luckily she managed to explain it, because we do know it's often elders. If they're accused of witchcraft, it's not common, but it happens that vigilante justice is taken out against those individuals.
All right, Joseph.
Yes, Professor, I wonder whether you have anything to say, or whether you are surprised that a lot of Kenyans are trooping back to their traditions today in this age of information. And along with that, I wonder what you have to say on what it will take us as Africans to liberate ourselves from that place where space where we find ourselves in, driven by colonialism and its aftermath, and what exactly it would also take, because I have listened to a lot of Africans talk about that same problem. But we as leaders, we have also been kind of trained to defer to the white Western intellectual who tells us about our problem, which means we are likely to listen to you more than, let's say, Fanon. We may read your book more than Frank Fanon, who had a lot to say about it. So I wonder what you think, in your opinion, it would take us to get to a point where we can be able to consume the same information you're giving us from my fellow Kenyan without kind of thinking anything negative about it.
I feel like you're putting me in a trap and say, Like,
No,
you know,
not
as
I'm very honest. I'm a very straightforward.
asking the Mzungu to tell Africans how not to listen to Wazungu.
No, and unfortunately, that's the way you put it too directly. I was avoiding that. And actually, I'm not for not listening, but not to think that the African intellectual saying the same thing has a defect or something. You know, just like you would sit down, me and you'll be served first. It does not really necessarily mean I have a defect, but I'm sure you understand the person who is doing that has been corrupted.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the readership, the way we read. We seem to have a preference for a Western thought than that African thought that we may think came from voodoo to begin with.
So I think, and I'm going to be very careful. I have a couple of things. I did notice maybe about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, probably, well, maybe when Kibaki was in office, a different kind of nationalism and pride. You know, at the shops at Masai Market, you saw you see now young people wearing the beaded bracelets with Kenyan colors, or it says Kenya, where before I don't think I saw that very much. You know, and see people with Kenyan T-shirts on. You know, in Nairobi, where I didn't see that, you know, previously, and it may have just been, and that continues. So I think there is a shift in maybe how younger people relate to Kenya. It may be primarily a Nairobi kind of factor, and maybe it's a class issue where, you know, in Nairobi, people are circulating with people of different backgrounds. You know, they're speaking in English and Swahili and Sheng, and maybe don't know their native tongues. You know, they go back to the farm, they can't speak with their grandparents in the mother tongue. So I think there maybe is a shift. I also see it in things like literature, maybe less so. I don't see it as much in academic works, but things like Kwani, when that was still in existence, many of the novels that are starting to come back out of Kenya, you know, there were many back, you know, with Ngugi and Major Mwangi and some others in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. But I feel like there are many more that are coming now in the field of literature. And then there's some academics who are finding ways to go onto Twitter and Facebook and get their, there's the new online journal called The Elephant, where people are exchanging these really, really good ideas.
You by any chance know Wandia Joya?
I follow her. Yes, she was one I'm thinking of. She was one I'm thinking of.
That's what you actually triggered that in me. Okay.
Yeah. So I feel like, you know, and especially things she's saying about the education system, that, you know, we're just, I say we, Kenyans are kind of reproducing, you know, ideas that they get from abroad. So I feel like there is some very positive energy and discussions going on. For my side, so one of my jobs is to talk to the Americans before they go to Kenya, for example. So a couple of times I had students who went and volunteered in Kakuma. This has been some time ago. And I also teach a course called Development and Humanitarianism in Africa. But one of the things that I talk about, and these are mostly, you know, middle-class white students, and they're very energetic, and they want to go to a village. They don't know what a village is, but they assume every African lives in a village. They want to go to a village and they want to work in an orphanage, or and then they grow up and work for the World Bank or the IMF, and they want to come and tell Kenyans, or they work for an NGO and tell Kenyans about civil society and anti-corruption. But one of the things I see as my job as a scholar and as a teacher is to break some of that down and think, why do you think that Africa needs you? What is it in your background and in American thinking about Africa that you, a 20-year-old middle-class, white person from Northern Virginia has any kind of skill or ability that you can go to, rural Kenya and tell people about health or farming? How do you go and tell somebody whose family has been farming the same land for a century, how do you go and teach them about agriculture? So I feel that is important on my side, and it's small what I can do. It's one university, but I think it's important for to try and break that down before they go with those attitudes that these young people will go and say, I'm not a racist, I'm going to help, but it feeds into anybody in Kenya who is naturally looking to the Mzungu for knowledge or help. They feed into one another and they reproduce one another.
I agree. There is no small idea. It will gather momentum and eventually we'll get there. Thank you very much.
All right. I think we are coming to the end of the session because I had promised an hour and we already passed an hour. It's the African hour. Unfortunately. If Bernard has no question, Bernard, do you have a question or comment? If you do not, I would like to close the meeting today. And I want to thank you for coming. Thank you for your willingness. I didn't have to explain to you and go overboard asking you to come. You are very willing to come, so I am glad. It was a very easy invite. So thank you very much. And in the future, we can discuss other works that you've written. As you can see, these are very deep questions, very deep topics that are, as I mentioned, very rarely discussed. And thank you, Joseph, for bringing up some of those super, super sensitive topics. They do need to be discussed. They don't need to be hidden anymore because they're important. So thank you very much. I think that we are coming to a close of the session. And if nobody else has a question or comment, I'm pausing here for a second. I think we are dismissed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel, for organizing this. I really appreciate it. It was very interesting. Very much enjoyed all the questions and the discussion.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Let me ask Professor something.
Go ahead, Sam. Yes, go ahead.
Professor.
Both Sam and Joseph. Joseph, go ahead.
Professor,
Hey.
have you? This is the book I was talking about, and I don't know whether you have seen it or read it.
I've not seen that one.
Skeeter Wilson.
Okay.
Yeah, he talks about things that are amazing, and I like his presentation. And you reminded me of him. So, and he's in that group of the Wandias, Oganda, Professor Oganda, all those people. And so maybe one of these days I'll probably bring him here.
Excellent. Next time I'm in Boston, I'll come and visit also.
Oh, that would be good. That would be good.
Yeah, thank you.
I live in Springfield.
All right, Sam.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye.
Sana.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. Bye.